Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. I never thought a small town could feel so suffocating. I grew up in cities, in places where the streets never slept and the noise was constant. But after my job burned me out and my relationship ended, I needed silence, space, and a life that didn't demand constant motion. That's how I ended up in Hollow Creek, a town so small it didn't even have a stoplight. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name before you walked into the diner, where the post office still smelled like old paper and coffee. From the moment I drove into town, I felt something off. I chalked it up to nerves. The house I rented was old, a two-story Victorian with a sagging porch and peeling teal paint. The previous owner, a man named Thomas Bell, had died under vague circumstances, and the locals didn't talk about it. When I asked the real estate agent about the house, he smiled and said, "Some places are best left alone." I thought it was a joke. The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked boxes, walked the streets, and greeted neighbors who smiled and nodded politely, but never lingered in conversation. At night, though, I began noticing strange things. A feeling of being watched, first subtle, then insistent. Shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. Doors I was sure I'd closed were open in the morning. I brushed it off as paranoia. Old houses creak, small towns have eccentric people. I was alone now, and maybe I was imagining things. On the third night, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old window frames, but the voice was clear, deliberate. Ethan, it called my name. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned around and the living room was empty. I checked every window, every corner, even the backyard. Nothing. Yet I felt it, something unseen, standing just out of reach, patient and deliberate. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep. The next day, while exploring the attic, I found a hidden drawer in an old dresser. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was cramped and nervous. It belonged to Thomas Bell, the man who had died here. At first it seemed like an ordinary diary, but as I read, it grew increasingly disturbing. He wrote about shadows moving independently, whispers that followed him through the house, and a sense that the town itself was alive, watching him. I cannot leave. They know when I sleep, when I eat. I see them in the mirrors, in the corners of my eyes. They are patient, but they will come. Do not stay here. They will take you. I laughed nervously and set the journal down, trying to convince myself it was just the ramblings of a lonely man. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Closer this time. Ethan. The whisper was everywhere, inside my head and outside, impossible to place. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I pulled the blankets over my head and prayed for dawn. The days that followed were worse. Shadows began to take form, tall, thin, featureless, standing just beyond the reach of my vision. I would catch them in mirrors or windows, only for them to vanish when I looked directly. Once, while walking through the kitchen, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, though no one was there. Items shifted places. My keys disappeared and reappeared on the counter where I hadn't left them. Even the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the house itself was pressing against me. I tried leaving Hollow Creek. I packed the car and drove toward the highway, desperate to escape. But the road twisted unnaturally. Fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, and shadows seemed to stretch across the fields, following me. One night, I glimpsed a figure in my rearview mirror, sitting silently in the back seat, faceless, black, and impossibly tall. I slammed on the brakes, empty, nothing there, but I could feel it, patient, waiting. The locals were no help. Asking about Thomas Bell or the house was met with nervous glances and vague warnings. Mrs. Carlyle, the town librarian, whispered to me in the dusty stacks. "Some of us are marked. Once they see you, you don't leave. The town doesn't forgive. The town doesn't forget." I began to notice patterns, The whispers grew louder at certain times, almost like the house itself had a clock, a rhythm. At exactly 3:12 a.m., shadows pooled in corners, stretching against walls, moving where they had no right to. Faces appeared, half-formed, featureless, watching. I barricaded doors and kept lights on, but it didn't matter. The house, the town, they didn't just feed on fear, they thrived on it. I confronted it one night. I stayed awake, heart hammering, waiting. At 3:12, the shadows thickened, pooling across the floor and walls. A figure emerged, taller than any human, limbs bending unnaturally, face a void except for faint glowing eyes. "You shouldn't be here," it said, in a voice both inside my head and around me at the same time. I didn't know," I stammered. "You belong," it said. Ice ran through my veins. I realized then the truth. The town wasn't just haunted. It was alive, aware, and it had claimed me. The following days were unbearable. I could barely sleep. The shadows were bolder, moving out of corners, approaching me. Whispers became voices, speaking in languages I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. Furniture moved. Doors opened on their own. I stopped leaving the house. I stopped answering calls. I existed only to survive another night. I returned to the attic repeatedly, drawn by something I couldn't resist. The journal lay open, pages flipping as though by an invisible hand. More warnings, passages I hadn't seen before. They are patient. They feed on fear, never meet their eyes, never speak their name. Once they see your soul, it is theirs forever. And then I saw it, standing in the corner of the attic, black and featureless, yet familiar. It wasn't just outside me, it was inside my mind, twisting thoughts, shaping fear. I could not move, I could not scream. I passed out. Hours later, I woke on the floor, attic empty, sunlight streaming through the window. I thought it had been a nightmare, but the feeling of being watched remained stronger than ever. Leaving Hollow Creek wasn't enough. Distance didn't matter. The town, the shadows, the presence, they followed, patient, inevitable. I moved far away, renting a small apartment in the city. I thought I was safe. I was not. The shadows appear still, in corners, in reflections, in my dreams. Whispers rise in the silence, calling my name, urging me to return. Sometimes I wake to find doors open that I know I closed, furniture moved. I exist under the weight of it, aware that Hollow Creek has not forgotten me and never will. The truth is simple. Small towns like Hollow Creek don't just hide secrets, they claim them. If the town has seen you, marked you, it follows you wherever you go. You can run, but it is patient, inevitable, and one day it will take you. I try to convince myself I'm imagining it, but I know better. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Whispers call my name. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the wind carry it across the hills. Hollow Creek waits, patient and hungry, calling me home. One day I will belong to it. One day I won't be able to resist. No matter how far I run, I know I will never be free. I never believed that a quiet little town could hide something truly terrifying. Growing up in a bustling city, the idea of small-town horrors always seemed like the kind of thing people exaggerated for campfire stories or Halloween thrillers. But the summer I moved to the neighboring town of Red Hollow, everything I thought I knew about fear changed. I'd just finished my first year of college and wanted a break from city life. My cousin Matt invited me to stay at his family home for a few weeks. It was on the outskirts of Red Hollow, a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The drive from my apartment to Red Hollow felt oddly long, winding through dense forests that seemed to press in on the road. Even in broad daylight, I felt a strange tension building, a weight I couldn't explain. When I arrived, Matt was waiting on the front porch. He was all smiles, but his eyes were restless, darting toward the tree line at the edge of the property. "Welcome," he said, shaking my hand. "You're going to love it here. Just don't wander too far after dark." I laughed it off. Don't worry, I'm not some fool looking to get spooked by crickets and raccoons. He didn't smile back. I mean it, he said. Some things out here aren't normal. The first few days were uneventful. We swam in the creek behind the house, explored abandoned barns, and even tried hiking a nearby trail. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things, the feeling of being watched, the faint whispers in the wind. But there was a subtle unease in the air I couldn't shake. Shadows seemed too dark, movements too quick. One evening, after a long day of hiking, I sat on the porch and noticed a house across a clearing, partially hidden by trees. It was old, like something out of a horror movie. Rotten boards, boarded up windows, roof caved in. For reasons I can't explain, I felt drawn to it. Matt noticed me staring. "Don't look at that place," he said, voice low. "The Hartleys lived there years ago. Then one night, they disappeared. Just gone. The town won't talk about it, but everyone knows not to go near it." Curiosity sparked, as it always does with these kinds of warnings. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside picked up, carrying a faint whisper that seemed to call my name. I thought it was just the wind, but it repeated, clearer each time. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just coming from outside. It was inside the house. I told myself it was a dream and tried to go back to sleep. The next day, I explored the edge of the woods near the Hartley property. I found strange carvings on the trees, sharp symbols, repeated patterns, some of them seemingly pointing toward the house. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, and I started seeing shadows flicker between the trees. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. Something was moving there, just out of reach of sight. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The whispers returned, more insistent, growing louder, almost chanting in a language I didn't understand. I tried calling Matt, but the line was dead. The shadows in my room shifted and moved in ways no normal object could. My dresser drawers were open when I'd left them closed. My bag moved across the floor, and there were faint scratches along the walls that hadn't been there before. By the fourth night, I was terrified to even leave my room. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of floorboards, the wind scratching at windows, a faint knocking somewhere in the distance. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. The fifth night was the worst. I woke to the sound of footsteps pacing outside my door, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, heart racing. The doorknob rattled once, then twice. Then I heard the whisper, clear as day, almost right next to my ear. "Come." I bolted out of bed, screaming for Matt. There was no answer. I ran outside into the yard, expecting to see him, but the property was empty. The house across the clearing, the Hartley house, seemed different somehow. Shadows moved behind the boarded windows, swaying as if something alive was pacing inside. A cold gust of wind hit me, carrying the unmistakable smell of rot and decay. I tried to leave immediately the next morning, but the road back to town seemed wrong. The familiar turnoffs weren't there. Trees that hadn't been in the way before now blocked the road. The further I drove, the more I felt as if unseen eyes were tracking me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know how, but I eventually reached the highway, heart hammering, breath ragged, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Back in my city apartment, I thought I was safe. For a week, I tried to forget Red Hollow, the Hartley house, and the oppressive sense of being watched. Then came the phone call. The line was dead at first, filled only with static, and then I heard it. My name, whispered, chillingly calm. I hung up immediately, convinced it was a prank. But it wasn't a prank. That night, I saw shadows move in my peripheral vision. Doors I had locked earlier were slightly ajar when I checked. Objects I had left untouched had shifted. And I heard the whisper again, this time right outside my bedroom window. "Come back." I haven't slept properly since. I've tried to research Red Hollow, the Hartley disappearance, anything that might explain what I saw. The town exists, the property exists, but there's almost no record of the family. and certainly none of what happened to them. Locals are reluctant to speak, and if they do, their eyes dart nervously away, like saying it aloud might summon it. I write this as a warning, not a story. Hollow Creek is not alone in its darkness. Small towns hide things, patiently waiting for someone curious, someone willing to see what others ignore. The Hartley house is not abandoned. Something resides there, intelligent, patient, and dangerous. If you ever find yourself near Red Hollow, heed my warning. Stay on the main roads, avoid the forests, never go near abandoned properties, and whatever you do, do not follow the whispers, because if you do, it will follow you. And once it follows, there's no escaping it. Years have passed, but I still feel its presence. Shadows move in corners of my vision, whispers echo faintly, carrying across the empty spaces of my apartment. I know it is patient. It knows my name, and I fear one day it will call me back. I'm not exaggerating. I did not imagine it. The terror of Red Hollow is real, and it does not forgive curiosity. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A 7-day Caribbean cruise on the Silver Horizon, a gleaming modern ship with everything a traveler could want. Pools, fine dining, live shows, and miles of sunlit deck. I had my own balcony cabin on the 11th deck, the perfect vantage point to watch the endless ocean stretch to the horizon. I was alone on this trip, craving solitude, but I never imagined solitude could become a nightmare. The first 2 days were blissful. I spent my mornings reading by the pool, afternoons exploring the ship's shops and lounges, and evenings in the dining room, surrounded by strangers who laughed and toasted to their vacations. Everything felt normal, perfect. But on the third night, I noticed something strange. I'd been sitting on my balcony, watching the stars, when I saw someone, or something, moving in the water below. At first, I thought it was a reflection or a wave, but then I saw it again. A dark figure, human-shaped, gliding beneath the surface. I blinked. It was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, a trick of the moonlight or fatigue. The fourth night, the first real terror began. I was awoken around 2:30 a.m. by a faint knocking. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My cabin door rattled as if someone or something was outside. I told myself it was the ship settling, but then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, moving closer to my door. I reached for the cabin phone to call the front desk. Dead. Not even a dial tone. My phone? No signal. Panic began to creep in. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. The footsteps paused, then moved away. I waited for what felt like hours before I dared move. I spent the 5th day in a daze, avoiding the hallways, sticking to the crowded decks. But at dinner, I noticed passengers behaving oddly. Some sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Others moved in subtle jerky motions like marionettes on invisible strings. Their eyes were hollow, or perhaps they were just empty. The thought unnerved me so much I barely touched my food. By the 5th night, things escalated. I woke again to knocking, softer this time, but accompanied by whispers, soft, high-pitched, almost melodic, repeating my name. I forced myself to leave the cabin, walking cautiously into the hall. The lights flickered, casting long shadows. Doors appeared where they shouldn't, leading to corridors I had never seen. I walked down one, drawn toward a dim glow at the end. There, a figure stood. A crew member, I thought, but their movements were wrong. Jerky, unnatural. Their face was pale, almost waxen, and their mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. When they moved toward me, I turned and ran. The stairwells were no longer safe. I discovered that the ship's layout was changing, corridors twisting impossibly, staircases descending deeper than they should, doors opening into rooms filled with water. Some rooms had faces beneath the surface, pressing upward with mouths opening and closing silently. I screamed, banging on the doors, but they were unyielding. By the 6th night, I realized I could not stay in my cabin. I stayed on the upper decks, hoping the open air would keep me safe. But the ship itself seemed alive. The wind carried whispers, the waves reflected faces that weren't mine, and shadows moved across the deck as though they were searching. I spotted one of the strange figures from the hallways standing at the railing, watching me. The figure's head tilted unnaturally as if listening. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. I tried the lifeboats, hoping to escape. I untied one, pushed it into the water, and began to paddle frantically. Behind me, the ship loomed impossibly large, its decks twisting in ways no architectural plan could justify. Figures appeared along the rails, passengers, crew, faces I recognized but that shouldn't have been there, all staring at me, mouths opening in silent screams. The water churned, and shapes swirled beneath the surface, reaching for me, whispering my name. I don't know how long I paddled, hours, maybe more. When the sun rose, I found myself on a small, deserted island. Rescue came eventually, but there was no record of the Silver Horizon, no missing passengers, nothing. Authorities dismissed my story as a hallucination, stress-induced paranoia, or sleepwalking. I wanted to believe them, but I know what I experienced was real. Months later, I still have nightmares. At night, I hear faint knocks on my apartment door, or footsteps on the floor above. Shadows move in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I look directly at them. I see shapes in the water whenever I take a shower or glance at the ocean in photos. The ship is out there somewhere, waiting. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that one day it will come for me again. I tell people it was a dream, a strange, terrifying dream. But I know the truth. Cruise ships like the Silver Horizon are not just vessels, they are hunting grounds. And the moment you step aboard, the moment you let the waves carry you away from the safety of land, you are no longer a guest. You are prey. No one believes me. No one ever will. But I know. And that knowledge haunts me every waking hour. The ocean is vast, infinite, and full of secrets. Some of them, I've learned, are better left undiscovered. The last memory I have from the ship is of a corridor that should not exist. Walls slick with water, faces beneath the surface reaching upward, all whispering my name. I ran, I paddled, I escaped, but the whispers followed me to land, to every moment of my life since. Sometimes, when the wind carries the smell of salt and engine oil, I swear I hear the ship calling, beckoning me back. And I know that if I ever close my eyes too long, if I ever forget, it will find me. I will never take another cruise, not ever. But I know deep down that it doesn't matter. The Silver Horizon is still out there, somewhere, slicing through the darkness, waiting for the next person foolish enough to think they are safe. And one day, it will come back for me. I used to love Christmas. The lights, the cold, the way every small town in America seemed to glow with warmth and safety. But everything changed after what happened in the winter of 2016, when I drove up to my mother's old cabin in northern Michigan for what was supposed to be our first Christmas together after years of distance. People always ask why I avoid the holidays now, why I never visit family, why I flinch at the sight of certain decorations. I never tell them the full story. It sounds too unbelievable, too disturbing, too wrong. But since you're here to listen, I'll try to untangle it all. Just understand something before we start. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm only trying to get this off my chest. I arrived at the cabin on December 22nd, late in the afternoon, with a trunk full of presents and enough groceries for a week. The drive up had been slow, thanks to the early snowstorm moving in from the lake. When I finally pulled into the long, winding driveway, I sat there for a moment, watching the cabin through the slanted haze of falling snow. The place looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Dark cedar walls, stone chimney, a porch that creaked under the lightest step. But something felt different. Not bad, just different. Like the shadows sat heavier on the building than they used to. I shook it off, It had been 10 years since I'd last been there. Nostalgia plays tricks. When I stepped inside, I expected the smell of pine and fireplace soot, but the cabin smelled almost metallic, a cold, sharp scent that reminded me of old coins. I flicked on the lights. Everything was tidy, too tidy. My mother had always been neat, but this was a kind of sterile neatness, like the house had been scrubbed by someone trying to erase any sign of life. I tried calling out for her just in case she'd come early, but the only response was the low hum of the heater. She wasn't supposed to arrive until the following day. I had beaten the storm and the crowds, or so I thought. The first hour passed normally. I unpacked the groceries, placed the presents under the fake tree she kept in the living room, and lit a few candles to give the place some warmth. But the odd metallic smell kept bothering me. No matter where I walked, kitchen, hallway, bedroom, there it was, lingering like breath on the back of my neck. Around 6, the storm hit hard. Snow smacked the cabin walls in thick, heavy sheets. The wind howled outside, bending the treetops, rattling the windows in their frames. I've lived through plenty of Michigan winters, but something about this storm felt strange. The wind wasn't blowing randomly, but rather circling the cabin in measured patterns. I told myself I was being dramatic. I decided to go out to the porch to bring in the firewood before it got buried. I threw on a coat, opened the door, and froze. There were footprints in the snow. But these footprints were not leading toward the house. They were leading away from it. Deep prints, starting right at the front door, as if someone had been standing against it or had just walked out moments before I arrived. They disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the white. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen any other car on the way up, and the cabin had been locked when I arrived. I crouched down to inspect them. They were bigger than my mother's, bigger than mine. A man's footprints, heavy and deliberate, but what bothered me wasn't the size. It was the fact that only one set of footprints existed. No returning path, no scatter of movement, just a perfect line of steps leading away into nowhere. I backed into the cabin and shut the door, hard. For the rest of the evening, I tried to pretend I hadn't seen them. I cooked dinner, watched an old movie, and wrapped the last few presents. But I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the knob to turn. My nerves were so tight that when the furnace kicked on, I nearly dropped my glass. Sometime around midnight, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard something move in the living room. A soft shuffle, like fabric brushing across the floor. I held my breath. There it was again, slower this time. A dragging sound, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding. I listened for 10 minutes, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the cabin settling. Old wood swells in winter, houses make noises, but deep down, I didn't believe that. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of music. Not loud, not cheerful, just faint, like an old Christmas hymn played on a warped vinyl record. I got out of bed slowly. My feet felt numb against the cold floorboards as I crept down the hallway. The music grew clearer as I approached the living room. A slow, haunting version of O Come, Emmanuel." The tree lights were blinking, though I hadn't turned them on, and at the base of the tree, a new present sat that I hadn't placed there. Small, wrapped in brown paper, no tag. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. The music stopped abruptly. The air shifted, and that metallic smell flooded the room again. I turned around expecting someone to be standing behind me, but no one was there. I checked the front door, still locked, deadbolt still in place, windows sealed, no signs of entry. But the footprints outside remained, clearer now that the snow had eased for a moment, like fresh steps that hadn't been covered. I barely slept the rest of the night, drifting in and out until morning. When my mother called the next day to say she couldn't make it because the storm had shut down the roads, I almost begged her to try anyway. But I stopped myself. I didn't want her driving through dangerous weather, and I didn't want her walking into whatever this was. Instead, I told her I'd be fine. That was the last time during the trip that I lied to her. Christmas Eve was quieter, but the odd sensations continued. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and the candles would be blown out. Sometimes I'd hear faint footsteps upstairs, even though I'd only unpacked the lower level. The radio turned itself on twice. Once it played static. The second time, a voice whispered something unintelligible before shutting off. But the worst part was the brown paper box under the tree. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened. It didn't belong there. It felt wrong, like it radiated cold. I considered taking it outside and throwing it into the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. By Christmas morning, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The storm had quieted overnight, leaving the world outside coated in white that glittered in the early sunlight. I forced myself into some Christmas spirit, made coffee, turned on a holiday playlist, and opened a few gifts my mother had sent early. For a brief moment, things felt normal. Then I heard the knock. 3 slow knocks on the front door. I froze in place. I don't know why I was so afraid. People knock on doors all the time, but something inside me knew not to answer it. The knocks came again, softer this time. I walked toward the door. My hand hovered over the knob, and then the metallic smell hit me again. I stepped back instantly. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't human. I can't explain how I knew. It wasn't logic. It was instinct, some primal alarm screaming at me to stay away. A third knock came. This one wasn't a knock, but more like a scrape. A long, dragging sound sliding down the wood. Then silence. I waited almost a full minute before peering through the side window. No one was there, but the footprints were. Fresh ones, leading right up to the door. And they were different from the ones I'd seen the first night. These were deeper, closer together, like whoever made them was standing still for a long time. I backed away from the door and grabbed my coat. I had decided I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. Storm or not, I'd find a way out. I rushed to my room to pack my bag, and when I stepped inside, everything went cold. The bedspread was pulled back, the pillows were rearranged, and on the nightstand, placed neatly, carefully, was the brown paper box from under the tree. I swear it hadn't been there when I left the room. I would have seen it. My throat tightened. Slowly, with shaking hands, I approached the box. The paper felt brittle and cold as I lifted it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was of me, standing at the front door, taken just moments earlier, judging by the position of my hand on the doorknob and the Christmas sweater I'd put on that morning. But the detail that made my blood run cold was not me. It was the tall, dark figure standing directly behind me in the photo. A figure I had not seen. A figure with no face. A figure whose hands were pressed against the door as if it had been trying to get inside. I staggered backward, dropping the photo. I don't remember grabbing my keys or zipping my suitcase or putting on my boots. All I remember is running, bursting through the door into the snow, sprinting to my car, slipping twice but not stopping. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to know if something was there. My car door froze for a moment before it opened. I jumped in, jammed the key into the ignition, and prayed it would start. It did. As I reversed down the driveway, I finally looked up at the cabin, and there, standing on the porch where I had just been, was a tall silhouette, motionless, watching me leave. The storm picked up again, wiping the figure from view between gusts of snow. I drove all the way back to Detroit without stopping. I didn't answer my mother's texts until I was safely home. I didn't sleep for 2 days. When I finally gathered the courage to look through my luggage, I found something stuffed inside one of the outer pockets. The Polaroid. The same one I saw in the cabin. Except this time, there was something written at the bottom in thick black ink. Next Christmas, I moved apartments in January. I stopped visiting the cabin. I told my mother to sell it or burn it or abandon it. She didn't understand why, but she listened. Every year since then, starting around December 20th, I get a small package in the mail. No return address, brown paper wrapping. Inside each one is a Polaroid. Each photo is of me, sometimes taken from outside my apartment window, Sometimes from inside a store while I'm Christmas shopping. Sometimes from the parking garage at work. Always from behind, always up close, always signed with the same message. This Christmas, next Christmas, soon. Last year said, I found you. This year's hasn't arrived yet, but it will. It always does. People ask why I hate Christmas. They think I'm being dramatic. They think I'm just cynical or depressed, but I know the truth. Something followed me from that cabin. Something watches me every year. Something waits for Christmas. And I know, deep down, that one year, it won't send a photo. It'll come in person. And when it does, I don't think I'll be able to run a second time. I used to think that buying a house was the ultimate sign of finally getting my life together. A milestone. Something solid, stable, rooted. I grew up in rentals where the walls were thin and the ceiling stained, places where neighbors fought loudly and strangers loitered at night. Owning a house always sounded like peace. It wasn't. Last year, after a decade of saving every extra dollar and living as cheaply as I could, I bought my first home, a small two-story place in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. Built in the 1940s, modest, a little worn but charming in its own way. It was the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs at dusk and waved even if they didn't know you. The kind of place where you don't expect anything bad to happen. I still remember the first time I stepped inside after signing all the paperwork. The air felt heavier than I expected, like the house had been sealed shut for a long time. But that's normal in old homes, I told myself. Houses that sit empty for months collect a certain stillness. I didn't notice anything unusual that first day, except for the basement door. It was the only part of the house that seemed wrong. It was an old wooden door built into the hallway wall just off the kitchen. The house inspector told me the basement itself was fine, dry, structurally sound, but the door didn't look fine at all. Deep scratches ran along the lower half, some wide and jagged, some thin like they were made with a knife. Not the kind of scratches you get from moving furniture, more like something clawed at it over and over for years. The inspector shrugged when I pointed it out. Old houses have stories, he said. Probably an old dog. But the scratches weren't shaped like paw marks. They were too long, too straight, too desperate. I should have walked away right then. The first few nights, nothing happened. I slept on a mattress on the floor with unpacked boxes stacked around me. The house creaked a lot, but old houses do that. Every sound was something I could blame on pipes or floorboards or wind. It wasn't until the fourth night that I woke up to the unmistakable sound of footsteps downstairs. At first, I thought it was someone outside, but no, these weren't muffled or distant. They were inside the house, slow and deliberate, crossing the kitchen. I held my breath. Another step, then another. The steps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I waited for the knob to turn. My mind raced through every possibility. Intruder, leftover worker with a spare key, maybe someone had been living in the basement. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The knob never turned. Eventually, I worked up the courage to swing my legs out of bed quietly and grab the baseball bat I'd leaned against the wall. I crept to the door and pulled it open fast, ready to swing. There was nothing there. I checked every room upstairs. Nothing. Then I checked the entire downstairs. Nothing. The basement door was closed, and something about that made my hands shake. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Not alone. Not in the middle of the night. I told myself it had just been the house settling. Maybe the sound was traveling through vents. Maybe my half-asleep brain exaggerated footsteps. I convinced myself. Until it happened again the next night, and the night after that. And then the basement door started to open on its own. It didn't slam open dramatically. It didn't creak open like in a movie. It was always just slightly ajar in the morning, wide enough for a hand to slip through. I would double latch it every night. There were 2 locks, top and bottom, but in the mornings, one lock would be undone. sometimes both. I changed the locks. It still happened. I nailed the door shut. By the next morning, the nails were lying on the floor. That was the moment I realized I was dealing not with an intruder, but with something inside the house. Still, I didn't leave. People always say, "Why don't you just move?" as if it's that easy. I had put every dollar I had into that house. I couldn't afford to abandon it. Besides, part of me needed to understand what was happening. I needed answers. The turning point came 2 weeks later. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on when I woke up to the sound of humming. A woman's voice, soft but clear, coming from somewhere behind the kitchen. It wasn't a song I recognized, but the melody was slow and sad, like a lullaby sung decades ago. It drifted down the hallway, too real to be a dream. The humming was coming from the basement. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe, barely blinked. The voice went on for at least 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever was humming suddenly realized I was awake. And then the footsteps started again, ascending the basement stairs. My entire body turned cold. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering that someone was in my house. The operator told me to stay somewhere safe and wait for the police. The footsteps reached the basement door. I stared at the door from across the living room, expecting it to open, expecting to see someone or something step out. But nothing happened. The police arrived 10 minutes later. They searched the entire house while I stayed outside under the porch light, shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone. An officer eventually came out and told me there was no one inside. He also told me something else. "You know there's a room down there, right?" he asked. "What room?" "In the basement. A small one, in the back. The door was stuck, but we forced it open. Old storage room, maybe?" Except I'd been in the basement before, twice. There was no extra room. The basement was one open space, no walls, no doors. But when the police took me downstairs, sure enough, there was a narrow wooden doorway at the far end. The door was splintered from where they had forced it. Inside was a tiny room, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with walls made of old cement and no windows. It smelled like rot and damp earth. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the room, facing the wall. And carved into that wall were hundreds of lines, tally marks etched deep like someone had scratched them with something sharp. Days, months, years? I don't know. The police found nothing else. No signs of recent activity, no fingerprints except mine from touching the doorknob. They left with a polite but dismissive tone, as if I had wasted their time. But something changed after that night. The house got louder. Every day around 3 a.m., the same sequence repeated itself. Footsteps in the kitchen, then in the hallway, then outside my bedroom door. They never went farther, never tried to open the door, but they were always there, as if the thing in the house was learning the boundaries of where it could go. Then objects started moving, not thrown across the room, just shifted slightly. My toothbrush moved from the sink to the bathtub edge. A cup I left in the kitchen ended up on the stair landing. My bedroom window opened in the middle of the night, even after I latched it. I installed cameras that covered the living room, kitchen, and hallway. 2 nights later, I finally caught something. At exactly 3:02 a.m., the camera in the kitchen glitched, just a quick distortion. But during that split second, a shadow appeared. Not a person, not an intruder. A tall, thin silhouette that stretched too high for a normal human shape. The shadow stood near the basement door. Then the camera went back to normal. I quit sleeping after that. I stayed awake until exhaustion knocked me out, but every time I slept, the same dream came. Someone standing at the foot of my bed. I could never see their face, just the outline of a woman with long hair, head tilted, watching me sleep. The dream always ended the same way. She leaned close and whispered, "Let me up." Not, "Let me out," "Let me up." I didn't understand what that meant until the night the floorboards in my bedroom began to shift. It happened at 3 a.m. again. I was awake, staring at the ceiling, and the boards near the foot of my bed made a cracking noise, and then another. Something was pushing up from underneath. I shot out of bed so fast I stumbled into the wall. The boards rose slightly, like something underneath them pressed a hand against the underside. I ran out of the room and slammed the door. By morning, the boards were back to normal. I finally decided to dig into the history of the house. I spent hours at the local library and the town records office, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. It didn't take long to find something. In 1964, a woman named Margaret Hale lived in my house with her teenage daughter, Ruth. Neighbors described the mother as reclusive, paranoid, and deeply religious. Her daughter rarely attended school. Local rumors said the mother believed the girl was possessed or marked, depending on who you asked. One night, both of them disappeared. The mother's car was gone, so police assumed they had left town. The house sat empty for nearly a year before being sold again. But the creepy part wasn't their disappearance. It was the fact that the basement room, listed in the earliest home inspection reports, didn't originally appear in any documentation after that. As if someone sealed it up, buried it, forgot it. I tried to convince myself that I wasn't in danger. After all, whatever was happening hadn't harmed me. Not physically, anyway. But then came the night when everything finally revealed itself. It started like every other night. Footsteps at 3 a.m., stopping outside my bedroom door. I stayed awake, frozen, clutching my phone. But then something new happened. The footsteps continued past my door, and then slowly, agonizingly, they began climbing the stairs to the attic. The attic I had never opened. The attic I had no reason to use. The attic that, according to the house's original drawings from the 1940s, should not have been big enough to walk in. My curiosity overpowered my fear. I grabbed the baseball bat and crept up the stairs. Each step felt like I was walking into a trap I'd set for myself. At the top was the narrow pull cord to open the attic hatch. I pulled it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ladder creaked down. Cold air rushed past me, colder than winter air. It smelled like old dirt and rust. I climbed up. The attic wasn't at all what it should have been. It was too big, stretching far into the darkness. The roof beams were warped, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. But the worst part was the far wall. Someone had drawn hundreds of pictures on it, charcoal drawings, childlike sketches. All of them showed the same thing, a girl standing at the bottom of a staircase, her arms reaching upward. The drawings varied in style and size, but every single one showed her looking up, like she was waiting for someone to help her climb, or like she wanted to climb up to them. My heart hammered as I moved closer. I scanned the drawings until one scribble near the center caught my eye, a depiction of the basement, the tiny room, the chair, the tallies on the wall, and beneath it, in shakily scrawled handwriting, "She won't stay down." I stumbled back, realizing the attic wasn't just storage, it was a warning. I scrambled down the ladder and raced to the basement door. I had to see for myself. I had to know what was happening in that house. The house felt alive as I descended the basement steps. Heavy air pressed on my chest. The room in the back looked even darker than before, as if light refused to enter it. I stepped inside. The chair in the center had moved. It now faced the doorway, like someone had been sitting in it, watching the basement, and the tallies on the wall. There were fresh ones, new lines carved over old ones, still flaking with pale gray dust on the floor. Something wanted me to know it was still here. I backed out slowly, refusing to turn my back on the room. I shouldn't have looked away. The instant I stepped into the main basement space, something grabbed my ankle. I crashed to the floor, hitting my head against the concrete. My vision blurred, but when I looked down, nobody was there. Yet the grip tightened, icy and unseen, pulling me toward the small room. I clawed at the floor, kicking, screaming, but it dragged me across the cold cement. My nails split against the ground. I felt myself being pulled into the darkness of the back room, the air chilling with every second. Then, just as suddenly, It let go. I scrambled to my feet, bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and shoved every piece of furniture I could find against it. Something slammed once against the other side. Then, silence. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any sound. As soon as the sun rose, I packed everything I could fit in my car and drove to a hotel, shaking uncontrollably the entire way. I never went back inside. I sold the house 6 months later at a massive loss. I told the realtor the plumbing had issues and the floors needed replacing. I didn't mention the basement. I didn't mention the drawings or the attic or the humming. I didn't mention the thing living in that house. Sometimes I still dream of the girl in the drawings. I see her standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me with dark, empty eyes. Sometimes I hear humming from nowhere, soft and slow, like the lullaby from that night. But the worst part is that even now, months later, every single night at exactly 3 a.m., I wake up without knowing why. And for one split second, I swear I hear footsteps right outside my bedroom door. And sometimes, I hear the floorboards shift, as if something underneath is still trying to come up. I never liked winter. People talk about the beauty of fresh snow, the calmness, the stillness, how it makes the world quiet, pure, clean. But I grew up in northern Minnesota, where winter wasn't a postcard. It was a test of whether your car would start, whether you'd slip on black ice, whether your pipes would freeze overnight. It was survival, plain and simple. But nothing in 34 years of living prepared me for the deadliest winter I'd ever encounter. The winter I still dream about. The winter I still hear. It started the week I moved into my uncle's old cabin near the Canadian border. He'd passed away in October, and since I worked remotely and had nowhere particular to be, I volunteered to spend the winter cleaning the place up and preparing it for sale. Property values were rising. My aunt wanted to get rid of the memories. Fair enough. The cabin wasn't huge. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, creaking floors, a wood stove, and a wraparound porch buried under years of neglect. The nearest town was 15 miles away. Nearest neighbor, 4. I wasn't bothered. Honestly, I thought the isolation would be good for me. For the first few days, it was peaceful. The kind of quiet you feel in your bones. The lake behind the cabin froze earlier than usual that year, becoming a glassy sheet stretching into the tree line, reflecting the pale winter sun. I walked on it once, tentatively, and even through my boots I felt the cold sink straight into my skin. My uncle loved that lake. He used to ice fish there, sometimes all night, bundled up in layers, a lantern glowing beside him. My aunt once told me he came back from a trip white as a sheet, muttering about voices under the ice. He eventually brushed it off as exhaustion or the wind, but the way he'd said it stuck with me. I shrugged it off. People hear strange things when they're alone in the cold. On my 3rd night, the temperature dropped fast, so fast that the windows frosted over from the inside. I threw 2 more logs into the stove and settled into the recliner with a blanket. Around midnight, I started nodding off. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Then, I heard it. A single knock on the back door. I jolted upright. No one would be out here at this hour, and definitely not in temperatures cold enough to freeze your spit before it hit the ground. I waited. Another knock, slow, deliberate. I walked to the back door, each floorboard groaning under my feet. The small window in the door was fogged over. I wiped it with my sleeve. Nothing. Just darkness and snow drifting past like ash. I didn't open the door. Something in me refused. Something old, primal. Instead, I checked the front door. Locked, checked the windows, all sealed. I convinced myself it was a branch hitting the wood, or maybe the temperature shift pulling the walls. But the knocks kept coming. 3 slow taps spaced minutes apart. They continued until the fire burned low and the room dimmed. Only then did they stop. The next morning, I found no footprints in the snow. That should have been my sign to pack up and leave. But I was stubborn, maybe stupid. I told myself it was the cold messing with the structure, nothing more. 2 nights later, I learned it wasn't. I'd stepped outside late that afternoon to grab more firewood. The cold hit me so hard, my eyelashes stiffened. I grabbed the logs, turned to go back inside, and froze, not from the temperature, but from the drag marks. Behind the cabin, leading from the tree line toward the lake, the snow was disturbed. 2 parallel tracks, like something heavy had been pulled across the surface. The snow around them was discolored, speckled with something dark, rust-colored, blood. I crouched down. The drag marks continued several yards before they just stopped. No turn, no footprints, just an end point. And beyond that point, thin cracks in the ice, like something had gone under. I backed away, carrying the logs inside with shaking hands. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the knocks, but because there weren't any. The silence was worse. The next day, a storm rolled in. One of those brutal northern whiteouts that swallows the world whole. I couldn't see 20 feet outside. All day I sat inside, listening to the wind hammer the roof, waiting for something. I didn't know what, but I could feel it, like eyes watching through the snow. Around 8 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, slow, crunching through snowdrifts that should have been too deep for a person to walk. They approached the front door, then the back, then the sides of the cabin, circling. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped behind the house, right where the drag marks had been. I heard something scrape against the siding, long and low. Then came a voice, a woman's voice. It whispered my name. I stood frozen in the center of the room. My breath hung in the air. There was no mistaking it. My name, spoken clearly, too close. Then again, louder. I grabbed my uncle's shotgun from above the mantel, though I doubted it would do anything against whatever this was. The voice moved around the cabin, whispering from different sides, sometimes urgent, sometimes drawn out, almost mocking. Then something hit the window. A single tap. It was enough to break me. I ran to the bedroom, slammed the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and sat against the wall with the shotgun across my lap. I stayed there until dawn. No more footsteps, no more voice. But I didn't sleep. When morning came, the storm had passed. I stepped outside carefully, shotgun in hand. There were no footprints, but the windows, every one of them, had long streaks on the outside, not scratches, wipes, as if someone had dragged their hand across the glass while peering inside. Every single window. By afternoon, I was ready to leave. I packed what I could into my truck and tried to start it. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I popped the hood and found the battery frozen solid, cracked straight through. I was stuck. I didn't go outside again that day. That night the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. I heard them in the hallway, by the stove, near the bedroom door. My uncle's name was spoken too, softly, sadly. And then another sound, the one that nearly made my heart stop. Breathing. Slow, labored breathing coming from the living room. I inched out of the bedroom, shotgun trembling in my grip. The living room was dark except for faint moonlight leaking through a crack in the frost-covered window. Something stood by the stove. A shape, just a silhouette at first, broad shoulders, arms too long, head bent at an unnatural angle. It swayed slightly like it was trying to remember how to stand. I raised the shotgun, the shadow twitched, the head snapped upright, and even in the dim light, I saw its eyes. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were empty, hollow. Like two wells cut into a face that wasn't a face at all. It took one step toward me. I fired. The blast lit the room for a split second. The shape didn't fall, it vanished. Not like something dodging or running. It simply wasn't there anymore. The room was empty, but footprints, wet, slushy footprints, appeared on the floor, starting just inches from where the thing had stood, leading toward the back door. The door swung open, though I hadn't touched it. A gust of air colder than anything I'd felt rushed inside, and from outside came a whisper, not a woman's voice this time. My uncle's. I slammed the door and bolted it. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I hid under the bed, a grown man, armed, terrified out of his mind. I heard the thing circling outside, then the scratching started, on the siding, on the windows, on the doorframe. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't exist anymore, only fear. At some point, I must have blacked out. When I woke, everything was quiet. The morning sun shone through the frosted windows. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I had hallucinated everything. Until I saw the bedroom floor. Water pooled near the doorway. Footprints, those same slushy prints, led from the hall directly to the bed. To me. And then back out again. I packed in under 10 minutes. I didn't care about the cracked battery. I ran to the truck, turned the key, and by some miracle the engine coughed to life. I drove through the snow with the door still open, not stopping until I reached town. I told people I'd had a bad scare. A wolf, maybe. Or a bear. I didn't say anything real. Who would believe me? A week later, my aunt called. She'd spoken with the coroner about my uncle's death. He hadn't died from a heart attack like we thought. He'd gone through the ice, except the lake was frozen solid that day, too thick to fall through. His body had been found half a mile from where he supposedly fell. The official explanation? He'd suffered hypothermia, wandered, become disoriented. But she told me something that made my blood run cold. There were drag marks near where they found him, just like the ones behind the cabin. She asked me if I'd noticed anything strange while I was there. I didn't tell her. I couldn't. But I did tell her to sell the cabin immediately. She agreed. It sold in June. 3 months later, I got a voicemail from the new owner. He sounded shaken, asking if anything weird ever happened in the cabin during winter. He said he'd been hearing things, knocks on the windows, whispering in the hallway, something walking on the porch at night. He said it knew his name. He asked me to call him back. I never did, because I already know what's happening to him, and I know there's nothing I can say that will save him. The thing in that winter darkness, the thing that took my uncle, the thing that followed me through the house, doesn't stop. It waits. It moves. It learns. And if you ever find yourself alone in deep winter, somewhere far from town, somewhere where the cold feels alive, if you hear your name whispered outside your door, if you see handprints streaked across your windows in the morning, don't look. Don't open the door, because once it finds you, it doesn't let go. Thank you for staying until the end. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more horror.